In a town divided between the wealthy and the poor, Jay Williams, a young black mechanic, accidentally witnesses a murder committed by the son of a powerful mayor. Afraid for his life, Jay decides to stay silent. But soon, the tables turn, and he is falsely accused of the crime. As his world falls apart, friends turn away, his job is lost, and he faces abuse in prison. Jay must fight to prove his innocence in a place where his skin color has already marked him as guilty. Jay Williams was a young man who knew what it meant to work hard. At 22, he'd already been at Miller's auto shop for nearly 4 years, saving up for a dream he wasn't sure would ever come true. He wanted to open his own garage someday, but in a small, segregated town like Brooksville, opportunities were scarce for people like him. The town of Brooksville was divided, not just by race, but by wealth and opportunity. The South Side, where Jay lived, was a different world compared to the North Side, where the rich, mostly white families resided. The streets on the North Side were clean, lined with big, beautiful houses and manicured lawns. The South Side was marked by crumbling sidewalks, overcrowded apartments, and the smell of desperation that came with poverty. Jay's days were filled with the smell of motor oil and the sounds of engines roaring to life. He was good at what he did, and his hands moved deftly over the cars, fixing what was broken, bringing old engines back to life. But he wanted more. He'd often talk about his dreams with his best friend, Tony. "Man, I'm telling you," Tony said one day, leaning against the garage wall, "you got what it takes. You should apply for that scholarship to technical college. Get out of this place." Jay wiped his hands on a rag, his face set in a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking about it, Tony, but it's not that easy. Ma's still working 2 jobs, and there ain't nobody else to help her." Tony shook his head. "You always got excuses, Jay. You gotta start thinking about your future, man." Jay sighed. "I know, but it's hard to think about the future when the present's so messed up." Life on the south side of Brooksville was a constant struggle, but Jay tried to stay out of trouble, keep his head down, and focus on his work. However, he couldn't help but notice how things were different for people like him. For every broken-down car he fixed, it seemed like a new problem would arise. Another way the system seemed rigged against folks who looked like him. One night, after a long shift at the garage, Jay decided to take a shortcut home through a narrow alley behind a row of clubs and bars. He knew it wasn't the safest route, but it was quicker, and he was exhausted. As he walked, he heard the sounds of a commotion. Voices raised, angry shouts echoing off the brick walls. Jay's heart started to race. He slowed his steps, moving cautiously towards the noise. When he peered around the corner, his blood ran cold. There, in the dim light of a flickering street lamp, he saw 2 men struggling. One of them was unmistakably Adam Cross, the son of Brooksville's powerful and corrupt mayor, James Cross. Adam was known for his violent temper and his ability to get away with anything because of his father's influence. The other man was younger, dressed in a faded jacket, and he was desperately trying to defend himself. Adam was clearly drunk, his eyes wild with rage. "You think you can talk to me like that?" he slurred, his fist connecting with the young man's face. "You're nothing." Jay ducked back, his breath quickening. He knew he should leave, get out of there. But something in him froze. He reached for his phone and, with trembling hands, started recording. He had seen enough of Adam's unchecked violence, heard enough stories of people being silenced, to know that this needed to be documented. Suddenly, the struggle intensified. The young man tried to push Adam away, but Adam grabbed a nearby metal pipe and swung it with all his might. There was a sickening crack, and the young man collapsed to the ground, unmoving. "Oh my God," Jay whispered, his stomach twisting in horror. He kept recording, but fear coursed through him. What if Adam saw him? Adam stood over the body, breathing heavily, his face contorted with anger. He glanced around, eyes narrowing, as if sensing he was being watched. Jay quickly stepped back into the shadows, holding his breath. He couldn't afford to be seen. He knew what Adam and his father were capable of. A few moments passed, but it felt like hours. Finally, Adam stumbled away, his muttering fading into the night. Jay remained hidden until he was sure Adam was gone. Then, slowly, he emerged from the shadows, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked down at the young man's lifeless body and felt a wave of nausea. He wanted to help, but it was too late. Without another moment's hesitation, Jay ran home, clutching his phone tightly, his mind racing with fear and confusion. The next morning, the news of the alleyway murder spread throughout Brooksville. The official story was vague, a tragic street altercation, they called it. There was no mention of Adam Cross, no hint of his involvement. The narrative was already being shaped, molded by the influence of Mayor Cross, who would do anything to protect his son. Jay knew he had the truth in his hands, but he also knew the risks. Coming forward with the video could mean putting himself and his family in danger. The Cross family had deep connections within the police department, the legal system, and even the media. That evening, Jay met up with Tony. They sat on the porch of Jay's small apartment, the sun setting behind them, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. "I don't know what to do, man," Jay confessed, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "I've got this video, but if I turn it in, who knows what could happen?" Tony's eyes widened. "You got it on video. Jay, that's huge." "But you're right. The Cross family ain't gonna let this slide. You gotta be careful. Maybe go to a reporter or something. Someone who ain't afraid to stand up to them." Jay nodded slowly, the weight of the decision bearing down on him. "Yeah, maybe you're right. But even then, they could come after me. After Ma." Tony put a hand on Jay's shoulder. "Whatever you decide, I got your back, man. Just don't do anything crazy." But Jay didn't get a chance to make a decision. 2 days later, at the crack of dawn, he was jolted awake by a loud banging on his door. His heart leapt into his throat as he stumbled out of bed, groggy and disoriented. When he opened the door, he was met by 2 stern-faced police officers. "Jay Williams?" one of them asked. "You're under arrest for the murder of Greg Turner." Jay's eyes went wide with shock. "What? I didn't—" "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," the officer barked. Before Jay could protest, they grabbed him, roughly pulling his arms back and snapping cold metal handcuffs onto his wrists. Jay's neighbors were starting to gather outside, watching with a mix of curiosity and fear. He could see the judgment in their eyes that had once looked at him with familiarity, now filled with suspicion. The news of Jay's arrest spread like wildfire through Brooksville. Within hours, he was already being painted as a cold-blooded killer. On the front pages of the local papers, his mugshot was displayed with bold headlines that screamed, "Local man charged in brutal alleyway murder." Jay's world turned upside down. People who once greeted him on the street now avoided him like a plague. Even at Miller's auto shop, where he'd worked for years, things changed overnight. Mr. Collins, his boss, called him to a meeting a few days after his arrest. "Jay, I don't know how to say this," Mr. Collins started, avoiding Jay's eyes. "The customers, they don't want to come here if you're around. You understand, don't you? It's just bad for business." Jay felt a bitter lump form in his throat. "So that's it? You're firing me because people think I'm guilty?" Mr. Collins sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm sorry, Jay. I really am. But I gotta think about the shop." Jay left the garage that day feeling more lost and betrayed than ever. The whispers followed him wherever he went. "Did you hear about Jay Williams?" "Yeah, the one from the garage. Can you believe it? I always knew there was something off about him. He was even confronted in the grocery store by a woman he'd never seen before." "You people," she spat, glaring at him. "You're all the same. Dangerous." Jay's fists clenched, his body tense, but he said nothing. He had learned that, in this town, no matter what he said, it would never be enough to change their minds. When the day of his trial came, Jay already felt like a man condemned. The courtroom was packed, and he could feel the eyes of the town boring into him, judging him, labeling him. His state-appointed lawyer was unenthusiastic, barely putting up a fight as the prosecution laid out their case. The prosecutor leaned heavily on racial stereotypes, painting Jay as a troubled youth with a history of aggression. Jay's clean record and years of hard work meant nothing against the biases that filled the room. Jay Williams is exactly the kind of individual our community needs to be protected from, the prosecutor declared, his voice filled with false righteousness. A young man from a broken home, no father figure, a history of run-ins with authority. Is it any surprise he turned to violence? Jay sat silently, his jaw clenched, as he watched the jury. Mostly white, mostly older. He could see the disdain in their eyes. They had already made up their minds. When the guilty verdict was read, Jay's world crumbled. His mother let out a wail from the back of the courtroom, collapsing into sobs. Tony was there, his face a mask of shock and disbelief, but most of the townspeople just nodded in approval. "Justice is served," someone whispered. Jay was sentenced to 15 years in prison. As the guards led him away, he could hear the crowd murmuring, feel their eyes following him. They saw him not as an innocent man wrongly accused, but as a symbol of everything they feared. Prison was another world entirely. Jay was thrown into a cell with men who had committed real crimes, thieves, drug dealers, even murderers. And to many of them, Jay was no different. Rumors of his supposed crime spread quickly, and he was met with hostility from both inmates and guards. "Thinks he's better than us," one inmate sneered one day, "but he's just another killer." The guards were just as bad. They would call him names, thug and animal, mocking him every chance they got. When he tried to stand up for himself, they threw him into solitary confinement. For his own protection, they claimed. It was there, in the darkness, that Jay truly began to lose hope. Months passed, and the isolation began to eat away at Jay's sanity. He felt like he was drowning in a sea of hatred and prejudice. But then, one day, a guard slipped a note under his cell door. It was from Marcus, a fellow inmate who had once been an activist on the outside. "There are people who believe you, Jay," the note read. "Journalists, activists. They're digging into your case. Don't give up." For the first time, in what felt like forever, Jay felt a spark of hope. He managed to connect with Marcus during their short time in the yard. "What do you mean people believe me?" Jay asked, his voice a mix of hope and skepticism. Marcus nodded. "Your case is all over the news now. They're finding holes in the prosecution story, questioning the evidence. It's becoming clear this whole thing was a setup." Jay felt a lump in his throat. But why? Why would they care? "Because, Jay, you're not the first, and you won't be the last. People are starting to wake up to how deep this corruption goes. They want justice." Over the next several weeks, Jay saw changes. The guards were a bit more cautious, and he could hear whispers about his case from other inmates. News of corruption within the mayor's office was starting to leak, and even Adam Cross's name was coming up more frequently. After nearly a year of being locked up, Jay was granted a retrial. This time, things were different. His new lawyer, Rachel Harris, was sharp, determined, and unafraid to take on the corrupt system. She tore apart the prosecution's case, exposing every lie, every piece of fabricated evidence. She called new witnesses who testified to seeing Adam Cross that night, covered in blood and reeking of alcohol. Rachel even managed to get the original video Jay recorded submitted as evidence. When the jury saw Adam's face on the screen, his rage, his violence, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. It was no longer about Jay's supposed guilt, but about the corruption that had tainted the entire case. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Not guilty. Jay felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was mixed with exhaustion. He was free, but at what cost? Jay's release didn't magically fix everything. The town was still divided. Some people came forward with apologies, their faces filled with shame. "I'm so sorry, Jay. I should have known better," said Mrs. Thompson, a woman who had once been friendly with Jay's mother. Others, however, remained silent, their eyes filled with lingering suspicion. Jay understood that trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight. He didn't forgive everyone right away. He couldn't. The pain was too fresh, too deep. But he didn't let it break him. With the support of his new friends and allies, Jay began speaking out against the injustice that had been done to him. He joined local organizations, working to reform the very system that had almost destroyed him. He also decided to follow his old dream. With help from a few supportive community members, he got a scholarship and started attending a technical college. But more than that, he found a new purpose: to help others like him, who had been wronged by a broken system. Months after his release, Jay stood on the steps of the courthouse, looking out at a crowd gathered there, a mix of faces, some apologetic, some filled with hope. His mother stood beside him, holding his hand tightly. Tony was there too, his arm around Jay's shoulder, offering support like he always had. "We've got a lot of work to do," Jay said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "But we're going to make things right." The crowd erupted into applause, and for the first time in a long time, Jay felt a true sense of hope. His journey wasn't over, but he knew now that he wasn't alone. His fight for justice was just beginning, and this time, he had an army of allies by his side.